Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, Christy Clark is considering a run for the Liberal leadership. She did get called out, though, for having briefly joined the Conservative Party in 2022. There's evidence showing that. Well, we're asking you, who do you think is a top contender? And what do you think is a top issue in the Liberal leadership race? Plus, British author, columnist, and environmental activist George Monbiot joins us on the LA wildfires, climate change, and what needs to be done now. Our phone lines are open to you as well. I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. The Liberal Party says it will announce a new leader on March 9th. Now, the list of potential candidates is narrowing. Two people have announced they are running, Ontario MP Chandra Arya and Montreal businessman Frank Baylis. Meanwhile, former BC Premier Christy Clark says she's seriously considering it. Now, she's run into controversy, though, over the last weekend. We'll get into that in a moment. Others possibly stepping into the ring. BC MP and Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, Liberal House Leader Karina Gould, Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, and now former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. We're asking you, who do you think is the top contender for the Liberal leadership? And what do you think is the top issue in this leadership race? You can call us now, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone as well. And you can email bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining me to take your calls is Mario Canseco, president of Research Go. Hi, Mario. Welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. Great to be here.
All right, let's get to Christy Clark, making the headlines this weekend. So she's been in hot water because she hasn't even announced yet, but already this controversy unfolding after her interview with CBC's Catherine Cullen on The House. Let's take a listen. We've got a...
How long were you a member of the Conservative Party, Christy Clark?
Never.
But you voted in the race, did you not?
No, I didn't. And I never got a membership, and I never got a ballot. What I did, though,
I will say, Christy Clark, we reached out to the Conservative Party, who told us, in fact, that your membership was canceled.
Oh, well, why don't they come out and show my membership or my ballot? They never sent me any of those, although I wouldn't put it past them to manufacture one of them.
Okay, well, following that interview, the Conservative Party provided a screenshot of a membership database that suggests Clark had membership from June 2022 to June 2023. And in an interview in August 2022 with the Conservative Journal of Canada, Clark explicitly said she was joining the Conservative Party to support Jean Charest in the leadership race. And now she has since posted to X, formerly Twitter, well, I misspoke. Lessons learned. I've always been clear that I supported Jean Charest to stop Pierre Poilievre, not backing away from that. He's the most divisive politician we've seen in years, and I felt it was my duty as a Canadian to stop him in his tracks. I'm thinking carefully about running because he still needs to be stopped. But if we want to do that, our party has to accept change. Okay, so Mario, what are your thoughts on how this all unfolded over the weekend? How does it bode for her campaign?
It's not the best way to start a campaign. I think it's as easy as that. You know, this is somebody who isn't particularly well known outside of BC. If your first introduction is going to be being called out for something that you say didn't happen, and then the federal Conservatives come out and say that it actually did happen, it definitely makes things more complicated. It's not an easy task. You have to essentially raise $350,000 to run. You need an organization. You need to appeal to Quebecers, because that is where a lot of these votes are going to decide who the next leader is. And it's not the best way to start. You know, the first comments coming out about this particular race for Christy Clark are negative.
Let's, I'm sure our callers will want to weigh in on that because she's, of course, very well known here in BC. Our numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And let's go through some of the other names. Mark Carney is expected to launch his campaign this week, according to sources. Former Bank of Canada governor. He became became governor in 2007, just as that global financial crisis hit. He's been seen, though, as someone who's left the country, who's gone and worked for the Bank of England as a governor there, more active outside Canada since. So what is the perception of him right now?
Well, it's very interesting to note that he's widely respected in financial circles. And usually what you want to do when you're running against the federal conservatives is to have somebody who understands finances. So that is something that might appeal to that usual voter that fluctuates from the liberals to the conservatives based on finances. So I think this is a good thing for him. He can be a more appealing candidate. Similar situation with Christy Freeland, who was the Minister of Finance. I think they start from a significantly better position, especially once they launch. If they have the support of a significant number of MPs, then it makes things easier. But the big challenge, and history has shown this repeatedly, is for Anglophone leaders to try to connect in Quebec. Lester Pearson in the 1960s is only able to get a minority government. John Turner loses the 1984 election after Pierre Trudeau. And then we have, of course, Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien. So if you're an Anglophone leader who follows a Francophone leader, you're bound to run into a lot of trouble.
And Christy Clark says she's working on her French. So there's that as well to prove to those voters. And now you mentioned Christy Freeland. I just want to ask you about this before I go to Nancy, who's our first caller. You could make the argument, her resignation precipitated this after weeks of calls for Justin Trudeau to resign as Liberal leader. She stepped down from cabinet. But what we've heard from the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre is that whether it's Christy Freeland or another minister, whether it's Karina Gold or Champagne, they have been MPs in lockstep with Justin Trudeau and his policies for the last 9 years. So whoever is elected, is it a kind of for now situation until we get into a general election?
You are going to carry that baggage. I think that is definitely problematic. It'll be more for Carney because we may not have a by-election that actually sees him in the House. It'll be similar to what happened with John Turner in 1984, although Turner had already served as an MP prior. It's also interesting to watch the development, not only in Canada, but also in some of the other Commonwealth countries. When the finance minister takes over from the prime minister, it usually doesn't go well. Paul Martin had that problem. Gordon Brown coming in after Tony Blair in the United Kingdom. So it's not as easy, especially when the situation is like this. You look at some of these elections, and we didn't have a significant number of people who were worried about housing, who were citing the economy and jobs as an issue. You didn't have the Conservatives as high as they are right now with the 18 to 34 and the 35 to 54 demographic. So can you appeal to those voters who are right now thinking Pierre Poilievre is the one who I want to vote for because he's saying the things I want to hear?
All right, asking our audience as well, who do you think is the top contender for the Liberal leadership, and what is the top issue for this leadership race? Give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And Nancy is up first now. Hi, Nancy.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for calling. So what are your thoughts on who or what is the top issue in this Liberal leadership campaign?
Well, I think the rest of the country should be aware of what Christy Clark did when she was premier of this province. There was a time that the legislature was called for a secret midnight meeting, and they cut the wages of all the healthcare workers in the province. And we're having enough trouble finding healthcare workers that you don't want to be treating them that way. And I think she's just a really dangerous woman, and I don't want her to see her getting any more power than she does.
Is it about healthcare funding? What is the biggest issue, do you think, for Christy Clark?
Well, they wanted to privatize everything.
And did that start with Gordon Campbell, do you think?
Oh, he's a creep. I don't know.
Okay.
That's
let's just
big mistake for BC, I believe.
Okay. Nancy, thank you very much. And we're just going to try and stay away from personal insults as we talk about the top contenders or what their chances might be. Mario Canseco is with me. And Mario, you talked about, Christy Clark is not as well known outside British Columbia. There is there is a lot of experience here and perception of Christy Clark having run BC as a province. How will that, what challenge does that pose for her? Or does it, given that, is she talking to a much broader audience now?
Well, I think it'll be complicated to connect because of everything that's happened with the party that she used to lead. Now you no longer have a BC Liberal Party that is a coalition of conservatives and liberal and federal liberals. You also have a lot of baggage there. We ask a question once every year about the best recent premiers of the country. It used to be a tie between Christy Clark and Gordon Campbell as the worst one. The last couple of times we've asked, she's ahead on this indicator. A lot of it is recency bias, of course, but definitely not a situation where you can connect and say, I am somebody who is very well known and who's very respected. It's going to be difficult. And also, I think there's been a lot of time from the moment when she was relevant politically in this province to now. So it could be similar to what happened with Kevin Falcon. Yes, he used to be somebody, but what he was trying to sell in 2021 and 2022 didn't resonate with many British Columbians.
Okay, now let's go now to Mary, who's joining us on the line. Hi, Mary.
Hi there, Michelle. Thanks for taking the call.
Sure. And what are your thoughts on the Liberal leadership race and who may be running and what are the top issues they need to deal with, do you think?
Sure. I think Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland are probably going to be the out front leaders. They both have a very strong finance and negotiation background in business, and that's what we need right now. And in terms of bringing up the rear, that would be Christy Clark. I don't know if many people remember this, but she spent millions and millions and millions of taxpayer dollars fighting in every level of court, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada against the Teachers Federation of British Columbia for 12 years. When the decision finally came down from the Supreme Court, they reinstated the original teacher's contract from 2002 when she was Minister of Education under Gordon Campbell. She carried on that fight as Premier, and it destroyed so many children in that time.
Well, Mary, do you think, though, given that education is provincial, what relevance will that have for someone who's running for to be federal leader?
Well, the fact that she's willing to spend taxpayer dollars to fight against the future of our education and the future of our country in court to strip them of what is rightfully theirs, and her own child went to private school, I don't think many Canadians would put up with that kind of decision making. Mary,
thank you very much for the call. Do you want to weigh in on that, Mario?
It's definitely something that those who want to run against her will mention. I think there's a history there of complexities dealing with unions, which is always exacerbated in a province like ours. This is different from if you were running for leader in some other parts of the country, but it's something that I think it's all part of a baggage that you bring, and that it's going to be something that your rivals in the leadership race are going to focus on.
One thing I want to ask you about is we've heard the financial background of Mark Carney, of Chrystia Freeland. Christy Clark was asked in the same interview on the House about the carbon tax, and she said she would not. She no longer supports it. She would remove it, and that BC's, she makes a distinction between BC's carbon tax and the way that she called it a Trudeau government carbon tax has operated. What do you make of that? There's certainly, I suppose from all of them, this need to address affordability and what role will the carbon tax play in this race for the leadership, do you think?
Well, I think the more they fight this battle in the arena that Pierre Poilievre has chosen for them, the less they're going to connect with the Canadian public. Right? You have already somebody who's saying, I'm going to take care of the carbon tax, I'm going to wipe it. It's been part of the Pierre Poilievre campaign for the past couple of years.
That's the tax, yeah.
So, do you want to play with his guidelines, or do you want to establish a larger conversation with Canadians about some of the struggles that they're having? Part of the problem with the Justin Trudeau numbers is we went through all the problems and the sacrifices during the COVID-19 pandemic. We were told this was all because of supply issues and complexities, And, I just found it ironic that in the same venue where he says, I'm stepping down, is the venue where we were watching in April and May of 2020, very happy and very giddy about the way the government was doing things. So something got lost along the way, and it's connecting with Canadians on the issues that matter.
That scene outside Rideau Cottage, following the hair and the beard growing, was also the scene where, that was over the pandemic. This was also the scene where he announced that he would be stepping down as Liberal leader and Prime Minister. Okay, let's take some more calls here, asking you, who do you think is a top contender for the Liberal leadership? The party has announced it will announce a new leader by March 9th. And again, new rules have been put in place as well for people who do want to run. Two have already put their names in, but expected to throw their hat into the ring. Christy Clark, former BC Premier, Mark Carney, a former Bank of Canada Governor, and Chrystia Freeland, as well as current BC MP and Resource Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. I should mention him as well, another possible BC representative in this race.
And it's an important connotation here because he was in charge of the environment. So there's something that could be appealing to that voter who is right now not particularly happy with the Conservatives, but hoping to have something that is more environmentally friendly. A candidate like him could work very well. Now, that being said, this is what we said about Stéphane Dion back in 2006, and it didn't go that well for him.
Okay. It's interesting to go back and see, right? All right. And when you think about Michael Ignatieff as well, who was seen as someone who was an intellect, but coming from outside Canada, and then a lot of those parallels being made now with Mark Carney. John is joining us from Grand Forks. Hi, John.
Hello.
Hi, what are your thoughts on what issues are going to be front and center in this leadership race, and who might be a front and center kind of candidate?
Well, I think the issue that should be front and center is environment, but also I think that Canada needs to recognize that over the decades, we have positioned ourselves to be a resource export country only, and in exchange for goods coming back across the border this way. And so we've left ourselves very vulnerable, and we can see that we are very vulnerable by all the talk that's going on with Trump tariffs. So what we need to focus on is creating more industry that allows us to be more self-sufficient for the basic necessities. You got to be able to grow your own food. You got to be able to produce your own goods that we use every day. The States does it. They do all that themselves. We don't have enough of that in our own country, and this is why we're so dependent on them. So this is something that we need to put a focus on and gear ourselves towards environmentally friendly practices. And so maybe Mark Carney is the guy that should be in charge.
Okay. So you see that, the ability to be more independent in that way, economically independent, but also being able to deal with the incoming presidency of Donald Trump, second presidency.
Yeah, I mean, just as a basic viewpoint, I mean, every country should be self-sufficient. If you're not self-sufficient, what do you have?
Okay, is that really possible, though, John? Given the way economies work, I guess that's a bigger conversation.
We've steered ourselves in that direction over the decades, and we can steer ourselves in a new direction. There's lots of countries out there that have a higher standard of living than Canada or the U.S., and they are self-sufficient.
Okay. Really good to hear from you. I'm glad you raised that, because is that going to be a big issue here? How are we going to deal with these threats of tariffs? We see that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has gone on to meet with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Of course, we've been hearing about Doug Ford already in Ontario. So how should these candidates present themselves as someone who's going to deal with these issues?
I think the most important thing is to advocate for what Canadians want to see happening. And what we have right now, because of the power vacuum, is everybody acting on their own. Doug Ford saying one thing, Danielle Smith traveling when she wants to, David Eby putting out press releases. It's more complicated. And I think this is the reason for Donald Trump to take this 51st state idea as long as he has. We didn't have this kind of situation back in 2016, 2017. Greenland was there. Canada was here. The Panama Canal was there too. But now he's a bit emboldened by what's happening. And we didn't see anything like this back in 2016 because he knew Justin Trudeau was very popular at the time.
Could this take over as the biggest issue in this leadership race or even in the election?
I think it's one of the most important issues right now because of everything that it entails. You know, you could have a situation where there's a tariff or there's a problem where the financial community becomes very upset with what is going on. And you also have to add the psychological warfare. You know, there's a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with the fact that the leader of the nation that we share a border with is talking about this so nonchalantly.
Let's take a couple more calls here. Linda in North Vancouver. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Michelle.
Thanks for calling in. Who do you think is a contender, and what are the biggest issues for this leadership race?
I think the biggest contender is Mark Carney. He's the one leader who sets himself apart of all the Conservatives' narrative about everybody's already attached to Trudeau, and so they're all the same. Mark Carney stands above that, I believe, and he also is the man who has the financial knowledge of being able to deal with this incoming tariff threat that we're getting from our neighbors to the south.
Okay. Linda, thank you so much. I'm sorry to jump in, but I want to get in Jacqueline in Vancouver as our final caller. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Michelle. I just wanted to say I agree with Linda about Mark Carney. I've been interested in him for years, ever since his name started getting floated. And I'm a very, very far left-wing voter, so that should tell you how broadly he appeals. But also in regards to, you'd asked the question about what do you think the issue, one of the top issues are. I'm 55, but I'm not in the seniors category yet in most situations. And I feel like the low-income seniors support is going to be a really big issue. And if the kind of baby boom and up can get their power organized, they will really have a fantastic lobby for all seniors.
We've been hearing a lot.
Looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah, Jacqueline, thank you very much. We're hearing a lot about affordability and the impact on seniors. I just have about 10 seconds left. You're watching this closely, I imagine, Mario.
We are, yes, and it's an important one because it's a generational change. I think that if there's one thing that is different now is younger voters, middle-aged voters are looking at the Conservatives as an option. This is different from years ago.
Mario, thank you.
My pleasure.
Mario Canseco, President of Research Co. Well, Christy Clark's potential bid to become the next leader of the Liberal Party also puts a spotlight on BC's place in federal politics. Now, BC Premier David Eby didn't say whether or not he would support her, but says someone running from BC is a positive to counteract focus on Ontario and Quebec. Here's what former BC Liberals campaign manager Karim Alam told the Early Edition host Stephen Quinn about the dynamic between BC and Ottawa.
You know, in a federal context, yes, BC's kind of always been a unique province. We've had to do things differently. You know, we have our own ferry system, and the federal government contributes $0. Back in the 70s, Ontario and Montreal companies didn't want to fund our car insurance, so we came up with ICBC. So the unique dynamics of having to govern this province have forced these weird coalitions. Yeah. But also at the same time, too, it's severely impaired our ability to get federal politicians elected. Turner, Kim Campbell, they both served together less than a year. We've never really had a strong BC voice in the Prime Minister's office, and it's kind of hurt our place in Confederation.
That is political strategist Karim Alam on the Early Edition. Lots of emails from you on the Liberal leadership race. Elizabeth writes, I think Christy Clark should not pursue her bid any further. She dealt herself a fatal blow with her interview on the House. Chrystia Freeland is considered a foe by the incoming U.S. president. In my eyes, that is a benefit for the Liberal Party and for Canadians. Heather writes, I will vote for Mark Carney, economist and fresh blood. Randy writes, it's Carney's race to lose. He's the best option. And Claire writes, I hope people understand that though Christy Clark was leader of the BC Liberal Party, they're not the same as the federal Liberals. Thank you for all of your calls on this and your emails as well, bctoday@cbc.ca. And of course, we'll continue to follow what happens and who announces officially that they'll be running for the leadership of the federal Liberal Party. Coming up in our next half hour here on BC Today, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to talk about those wildfires ravaging the Los Angeles area right now. And we're going to talk about climate change, what role it plays here, and what needs to be done now. And the author and political activist George Monbiot will be my guest, and he'll take your calls. That's coming up after this CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. Canada is sending more firefighters to California, including nearly 24 from BC. A crew from the BC Wildfire Service arrived in Los Angeles over the weekend, with another crew scheduled to leave tomorrow. At least 24 people have been killed in the fires sweeping through Los Angeles. Alberta and Quebec are also sending firefighters. Comox Valley Search and Rescue says its members helped to pull a man off Mount Cain on Vancouver Island who fell unconscious after a tumble while skiing. They say the 35-year-old skier was found outside boundaries in the mountain's West Bowl. The man was brought to a nearby parking lot after he was stabilized and paramedics took over. And BC's Health Ministry says it has approved a business plan for a new 2-floor building expansion to the East Kootenay Regional Hospital in Cranbrook. The ministry says the project will cost about $59 million, with construction expected to begin in May of next year. And now the forecast. A rainfall warning is in place for sections of the north coast with up to 60 millimeters expected. Highs around 4 degrees and mainly sunny this afternoon in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, mainly cloudy with a high of +1. Highs from -4 to 1 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, some sun and cloud with a high of 3. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, cloudy this afternoon with highs around 5 degrees. That's your CBC News Update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Rob.
You're welcome.
Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks very much for being with us on CBC Radio 1, as well as CBC Television and live streaming as well. Online, cbc.ca/BC. You can use our streaming service or find us on YouTube. We continue to cover the wildfires in Southern California. Now, last week, we spoke with the fire chief of West Kelowna. Of course, they were hit with that massive wildfire in 2023, the McDougall Creek fire. Well, Phil writes from Cobble Hill. Thanks for the show today on the wildfires in the BC interior and in the greater LA area. Although I agree that having landscaping close to a home could be a hazard when there's a wildfire close by, from what I've seen, areas with no vegetation in the wildfire areas of LA burned to the ground also. These were large commercial areas, shopping malls and shops along main roads. Even homes with ceramic roofs and plastered exteriors were destroyed. The heat temperature from these fires, fueled by extremely strong winds, are not defensible. Vehicles parked on the street were destroyed, even when houses in that neighborhood were spared. The Santa Ana winds, along with a drought, makes any preventive measures to prevent destruction to property impossible. Embers traveling 100 meters in 2 seconds makes it impossible to stop these fires from spreading faster than anyone can respond to. It seems to me no matter what measures are in place, we are at the mercy of luck. Even with measures, they will not prevent damage from wildfires, which thrive in drought and winds. So what defense do we really have against these highly intense and destructive climate-related weather events? Phil, thank you very much for that email. bctoday@cbc.ca is our address. The wildfires in Southern California are still ravaging the landscapes, with a human death count of at least 24 people so far and over 12,000 structures destroyed. Now, worldwide, we are experiencing devastating effects of natural disasters such as floods, storms, and wildfires. And this elevates the dialogue of the effects of climate change. Well, we're asking you today, what can we do now to prevent climate change-fueled disasters? And what are your questions for our next guest? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guest, George Monbiot from Devon in the UK. Now, George is a climate and political activist, a regular columnist, a longtime columnist for The Guardian newspaper, also the author of many climate-related books such as Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning, and Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. George, a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
What's been going through your mind seeing the wildfires in LA?
It's just devastating. One of the things that's occurred to me is that for many years, activists like myself have been saying it's the global poor who get hurt first and worst by climate breakdown. But what we're already beginning to see is some very wealthy communities being absolutely hammered by the impacts. Of course, not everybody in that area of Los Angeles and California being hit is wealthy, but a lot of wealthy people are now losing their homes and being displaced. So already it's accelerating beyond the point at which it hits primarily the global poor. We're already seeing the impacts of the greatest predicament humanity has ever faced, hitting people from all walks of life.
And as these fires burned last week, we learned from reports that 2024 was now the hottest year recorded in history. And the World Meteorological Organization said that this was the first year in which the global temperatures averaged more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above industrial age temperatures. So that was, of course, the threshold that the world was trying to stay under. How did we get to this point?
Well, decades and decades of deliberate inaction. It's not for want of knowledge. There's some people give the impression that it's an information deficit, but if only people knew more. But actually, we now have records showing that fossil fuel companies, some of them were aware of the dangers in the 1960s. They knew exactly what was coming down the line. In fact, some of their own warnings and predictions made internally within the corporations are uncannily prescient, remarkably close to what we are seeing today on a very similar timeline. It wasn't just the independent climate scientists who are saying what we are doing invites disaster. It was the oil companies themselves. But of course, that wasn't what they were saying in public. Quite the opposite. They were investing very heavily in what could be described as professional lying, setting up lobby groups, setting up distraction techniques, setting up climate science denial on a vast scale. And those of us in the environmental movement with far fewer resources were left to try to fight that. But unfortunately, we have eventually been overwhelmed by it. We just didn't have the power that huge industry and its political backers have. And frankly, so far we have lost.
Have there been, since we are reaching 1.5, it's not enough, but there have been efforts, right, at turning industry toward cleaner fuels, for example, efforts at turning to renewable resources. Have there not been those attempts, but they're difficult to pursue given the cost? We look at the cost of living crisis that as well is unfolding right now.
Well, that's not so much the problem, because actually some of the renewables we have available are actually cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives. It's more a question that to ensure action against climate breakdown is effective, it's more about the things you stop doing than the things you start doing. So you can say, well, look, we've got new solar, we've got new wind, we've got all these new technologies, they're fantastic, aren't they? But if you're still burning fossil fuels, unless you are leaving your fossil fuels in the ground, things aren't going to fundamentally change. It's a bit like saying, I went on a diet and I've been eating salads every day. Okay, I've still been having tubs of ice cream and enormous cakes every day. I don't understand why I'm not losing weight. It's the things you stop doing which are actually more important than the things you start doing. And while there has been some very substantial investment in greener technologies, there is still an even greater investment still ongoing in fossil fuels and other damaging technologies.
I'd like to get a caller a question to you, George, if you don't mind. George Monbiot is my guest, author, columnist for The Guardian newspaper, and a climate and political activist. Our numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. We're asking you what needs to be done now to mitigate the effects of climate-related disasters. You can give us a call, and Basil is on the line now from Port Coquitlam. Hi, Basil. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, fellow Englishmen coming to CBC. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Basil.
Yes, great. I appreciate your knowledge about this. And I'd like to ask you, obviously, I think, and as you was saying, the wildfires and the tremendous climate crisis we're having is a problem of what we're all doing and what we should be. And you're suggesting what we should not do. What do you think, as individuals, everyone as an individual citizen of every country, what should we not be doing to help our planet for our children and grandchildren?
Thank you, Basil. Well, the first thing to say is that we are at our weakness. We're at our weakest when we behave as individual citizens. We're at our strongest when we get together with our friends and neighbors and form movements and try to act collectively to create a mobilization for change. That's how change really happens. And for years and years, we've been told, oh, you are consumers, so you've got to change your consumption patterns. But actually, there's a limit to how much you can do by just changing your consumption patterns. It's the politics that need to change. You know, I can say, right, well, I don't have an SUV parked outside my house in the street, so I'm a good guy. But all that happens is that someone else can come and park their SUV in the slot that I've vacated. Unless you have a policy which says we're not going to have any recreational SUVs anymore, that's just not going to happen, then as individuals, we can do almost nothing. I mean, not to say nothing at all, because there are certain things which really make a difference, like flying less, like changing your transport mode. Don't buy that unnecessary SUV. The biggest shift that any one of us can make individually is to switch to a plant-based diet, because animal-based diets are a very strong contributor to the climate crisis. But as I say, any changes we make ourselves have to be embedded in wider political change. And the fossil fuel companies know this, which is why they've lobbied so hard against wider political change, and why in so many countries they've demanded new draconian laws against environmental protesters.
Let's take another call now. Basil, thank you very much for your call. Robert is up next now in Vancouver. Hi, Robert. Go ahead. We have George Monbiot here. And what are your comments around what can be done now around the climate crisis?
Yes, thanks for having me on, Michelle. I just have a statement to make, and I might mention that I've read a lot of George's work, and I think he's really done a lot to help the cause to, bring awareness to this, massive global problem. So what I wanted to say is I'm 70 years old, and I've been following the whole climate thing my whole life. And what I want to say is that NASA put out a study in around 2018 on ocean heating, and at that time they reported that the global ocean systems were absorbing the energy equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs per second, okay? And a couple of years ago, they updated that to 7 Hiroshima bombs per second. And I saw a video recently by a reputable channel, which I haven't fact-checked this, but they recently updated that to 13 Hiroshima bombs per second. So my point is this, and I don't want to sound too dystopian, and George can comment on this later if he wants. It's as though we have a bomb in our house with a fuse that we can't put out. According to my understanding, I think we blew through the guardrail long ago to the point where we could kind of do something about this. And so there's no way to stop this now. There's no way to stop the ocean from overheating. And what's happening now with all the climate imbalance all over the world and creating weather that's totally unpredictable, many farmers around the world are getting out of farming because they can't predict the weather. You know what? Some farmers, they got to take out huge loans before they plant the crops. And, you know, like, what do you do if, you know, nothing grows? You're in the hole for 200 grand. You got to sell your farm or something, you know? So, you know, I don't want to sound too dystopian, but the time to fix this was like 10 or 15 years ago.
Robert, thank you very much for the call. I know you don't want to sound dystopian, but you know, I appreciate your point, and you can't help but feel that way sometimes when you're watching this horrible footage from places like Southern California right now. George, I just want to read you a bit of what the New York Times wrote last week with regard to our emissions. And they said if we had started in 2005 to limit emissions, they would have been more gradual. 2015 would have been more drastic had action been taken. But it wrote, starting today would require cuts so drastic as to appear essentially impossible. What do you think? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Robert. I mean, you know, you do make a persuasive case. It's getting harder and harder to argue against it. And as you know, some of us have been saying similar things now for a very long time. I mean, this is my 40th year as an environmental journalist and campaigner. And I've essentially been saying the same thing all along. And the longer we leave this, the harder it's going to get, and the lower our chances of success. It's not to say they've yet reached zero, because, you know, while there's some things we can't stop and some shifts which are inevitable now, I think, we can perhaps limit the scale of the damage if we do take action now. But, you know, the returns are diminishing and the risks are increasing. It's a very bad combination indeed. And in the world's most powerful nation, they've just elected a climate science denier who is going to thwart and frustrate climate action, not just in the United States, but around the world. So it's not difficult to feel a sense of despair. All my working life, I've been kind of professionally optimistic, and I've tried to find the hope, and it's quite difficult to find it right now.
So what do you do then when, you know, you're talking about incoming president, U.S. President Donald Trump? He's elected by voters, and so there is not the public has not coalesced behind the climate crisis issue, or there are differing views, or there are other issues they see as more pressing. And we know again that inflation, cost of living was weighed heavily on the electorate in the last U.S. election. So how do you deal with the public view of this? How do you talk to the public around what needs to be done now?
I mean, we have to remember that this hasn't happened by accident. There has been a huge effort at denial, distraction, delay, obfuscation.
But how do you counter it now?
Climate science. Yeah, well, there isn't a magic formula. Look, you know, if there were, we would have discovered it by now, because believe me, we have tried everything. You know, we're in a primarily hostile media environment with a few obvious exceptions, and thank you for the exceptions. And we're now in a very hostile social media environment as well, particularly with Elon Musk's ownership of X and now Mark Zuckerberg effectively cancelling out attempts to control misinformation and disinformation. And of course, you know, the big money is being invested in misinformation and disinformation over climate science, because otherwise the writing would be on the wall for the fossil fuel companies. They don't want that to happen, so they invest in persuasion. So it's hard. Look, all we can do is to keep on trying, and people like me have been trying for a very long time. We just need an awful lot more people involved. But it's really, really difficult, because we are up against forces much bigger than ourselves. I'm not giving up. I'm not despairing. I'm going to keep trying to encourage other people to weigh in on this. But I am feeling pretty small and pretty powerless at the moment.
What keeps you going, George? Why are you not giving up?
Well, yeah, I mean, partly because I feel I owe it to my own children and to all the other younger people on Earth now. We just cannot let them down. We can't betray them. It's our generations which have caused this problem. We spend our lives telling our children, if you make a mess, you've got to tidy it up. It's your responsibility. And then we make a mess, an existential mess. And what do? We leave it to our children to tidy it up? It's just not right. It's not fair to do that. And so that there's a sort of very powerful moral case just to keep going by any means possible, however hard it might be.
My guest is George Monbiot, if you're just joining us, author of Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning, one of his books, and regular columnist for The Guardian newspaper, a longtime political and environmental activist. So we've been taking your calls, asking you what needs to be done now to mitigate the effects of climate-related disasters. And Ross is on the line in West Vancouver. Hi, Ross.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you very much. George, great to hear your comments. My thought was initially about a tipping point, George, but it sounds like your recent comments and those by the previous person on the phone, we've passed the tipping point. It's a desperate situation. So in terms of education, what is there in terms of a description of how desperate this situation is in terms of lives about to be lost in the world in, I suspect, dramatic numbers as crops fail, as flames continue to rage, as oceans continue to rise. What is there in terms of education that we can communicate to everyone that we contact, everyone in the free world, that would indicate how bad this is going to be unless we make dramatic change?
Thank you, Ross. And I'm very glad you raised this, and particularly the issue of tipping points, because that is absolutely fundamental to climate science, that we're dealing with complex systems. The atmosphere is a complex system. The oceans are a complex system. Every ecosystem is a complex system. The world's ice and snow, called the cryosphere, that's a complex system as well. And one of the common characteristics of these complex systems is that they have tipping points. They can absorb a certain amount of pressure, a certain amount of change, up to a point, and then they suddenly collapse into a different equilibrium state. And having collapsed into that different state, that's effectively irreversible. You can't push them back along the gradient down which they've collapsed. And we're looking at several potential, perhaps quite imminent tipping points, like, for instance, the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And that might not mean very much to many people, but it's absolutely fundamental. This is the heat transfer from the tropics up to the North Atlantic, which helps keep parts of the Northern Hemisphere temperate and mild and helps transfer heat away from the tropics. Without that heat transfer system, we would all be in very serious trouble indeed. Well, there's a lot of evidence that that is beginning to falter. We don't know how long it's got, but it could collapse into a shutdown state. It's done so in the fossil record many times before, but not while human civilization has prevailed on Earth. The consequences could be absolutely appalling. Similarly, the collapse of the Amazon rainforest, because the Amazon provides much of its own rainfall. If it gets beyond a certain tipping point, it can no longer do that, and the whole thing can just shift to permanent drought conditions and to savanna or desert, in which case there would be a further massive pulse of carbon into the atmosphere as the trees are oxidized. There's many, many other potential tipping points like this, and collectively they could tip the entire Earth system, which is a kind of system of systems. It's a meta-complex system.
Right.
And that can tip into a fundamentally different state to the one in which we evolved. And it's happened 5 times before in the fossil record. We call them mass extinctions, but actually a mass extinction is almost a euphemism for what happens, because it's a mass Earth systems collapse, one of whose results is mass extinction. But there are lots and lots of other results as well, like circulation systems just stopping, like the whole planet's surface effectively turning to desert. this is almost unimaginable. It's beyond any dystopian movie, apart from possibly The Road. It's a situation in which much of the world becomes uninhabitable to people and the other species on Earth.
You're right. It's almost unimaginable. I mean, hearing you speak and describe that, I'm sure is sending just shivers and chills through people right now. Let me wrap up with one final call here from Briar at Roberts Creek. Hi there, Briar.
Hi, I'm calling from Roberts Creek, BC. I have a bachelor's in environmental science and biology from years ago, but mostly I'm a mom now. My question or kind of question comment is, do you feel that there is a generational responsibility to be more financially responsible for climate solutions on those such as boomers who have the opportunity to benefit financially? It's been incredibly frustrating as a young family to see that we don't have a lot of the same opportunities and feel the pressure to take climate action.
Are you talking about
within our own lives.
a kind of tax? We know that countries have been talking about, being accountable, but what are you talking about specifically, Briar?
Essentially a tax on wealth for those pretty much of a boomer generation who would have had knowledge of these climate issues and the fiscal responsibilities of places that you put your essentially your wealth.
I'll jump
so
in.
You're making benefits on companies
Briar,
who are able to extract and not get anything back.
I'm sorry to jump in. I only have about 45 seconds, and I'd love to let George have his time to answer.
So thank you, Briar. Another excellent question. And the answer is fundamentally yes. There's a great intergenerational unfairness taking place now. We get the gain. We dump all the costs onto your generation and those that follow. That needs to be redressed.
George, I now have about 30 more seconds. Do you have a final parting word? I know it is all incredibly distressing. But what do you, for someone who does this for a living, talks to people about this issue, what is your parting word usually?
But first, I'm sorry if I've encouraged despair. I don't want to encourage despair. I mean, I can quite understand how that's the response which many of you are going to be feeling about this. It is an incredibly tough and difficult predicament. But, we have faced such things before, like the onset of the Second World War, for instance. And we saw nations all over the world mobilizing to respond to that. We need mobilization on that sort of scale.
I really appreciate your time. You're very busy, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Lovely to talk to you.
And you, George Monbiot.